In a world draped in silence and polished deceit, a black woman becomes the unseen earthquake beneath a fragile empire. Eyes flash with concealed contempt, corridors whisper cold exclusion, and every carefully constructed barrier bends, but cannot break the force she carries. Beneath the surface of quiet scorn lurks a truth so explosive, it threatens to ignite a reckoning that no one saw coming. This is a story not of mere prejudice, but of power shaken to its core, where identities collide and justice claws its way out from the shadows. Brace yourself, because what unfolds will shatter the illusions you thought were unbreakable. Like, subscribe, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. This is just the beginning. She moved without hesitation, but the moment she stepped beyond the revolving glass doors of First Dominion Bank, it was as if the building itself reacted. The ambient temperature felt colder. The fluorescent lights seemed harsher on her skin, and her footsteps, soft as they were, echoed with exaggerated weight across the marble. She walked past a row of potted trees and minimalist abstract art that screamed curated wealth. The marble floors glistened with a chemical shine, mirroring everyone around her, except her. She didn't fit the reflection. Elnora paused at the reception desk. She was early. Her appointment had been confirmed through 2 prior emails and 1 printed letter. She held a copy of it in her case, tucked neatly between legal binders and audit records. A young man in a tailored navy suit stood behind the counter, casually flipping through a glossy binder while chatting with someone on his wireless earpiece. He glanced at her only once, then past her. A tall, athletic white man in a golf polo stepped up behind her. The receptionist broke into a smile, nodding, and waved the man forward. Elnora was left waiting, unseen. She said nothing. Her presence had been erased without a word. 10 minutes passed. Another woman arrived, petite, blonde, talking loudly on her phone. Her red heels clicked sharply against the floor. She bypassed the small line entirely, walked up beside Elnora, and set her purse on the desk. The receptionist leaned in, laughed at her joke, and gestured her through. No form, no ID, just access. Elnora didn't flinch. She stood as still as stone, the same poise she had learned from 20 years of sitting in meetings where she wasn't expected to speak. The receptionist finally addressed her, not with words, but with a clipboard. He slid it across the desk without eye contact. It read, "Walk-in intake, financial counseling or recovery services." The subheading noted it was for clients experiencing hardship or undergoing second chance program enrollment. The print was faded, clearly reused. At the bottom, a small note said, "This form may not apply to all guest types. See staff for clarification." He didn't clarify. He turned away to answer a call. Elnora took the form, her fingers brushing the corner. She walked to the side lounge. It was colder there. The vents above whirred steadily, but her chair had no cushion, just hard plastic. She set her bag gently across her lap and started filling in the boxes. As she wrote her name, a security guard standing near the main elevators shifted his stance. His eyes followed her movement from the desk to the chair. When another employee passed by with coffee, the security guard said something in a hushed voice. The employee turned her head to glance briefly at Elnora, then turned away. 5 minutes passed. The janitor arrived, mid-40s, Latino, wearing gloves and pushing a yellow cart. He moved directly toward Elnora's section, set down a wet floor sign near her chair, and began mopping under her without asking. The mop head slapped across her shoes. She stood. No apology. He didn't look at her once. She shifted 2 chairs down. He followed. Same mop, same sign. Another guest gave her a curious look, but no one spoke. She finally moved to the edge of a lounge near a glass divider. There were leather seats there, but all were occupied. She remained standing, arms folded over the clipboard, the form still incomplete. One of the wall-mounted TVs flicked to a digital promo loop. First Dominion welcomes elite partners. Investment tier guests only beyond this point. Beneath it, the screen displayed an image of a perfectly dressed black man in a designer suit shaking hands with a white banker. The caption read, confidence starts with presentation. Elnora's blouse wasn't wrinkled, but it was old. Her skirt had no slit or zipper flourish. Her shoes were quiet, practical, invisible. Another staff member approached the seating area, holding a tablet. He began calling names: Lawson, Ellis, Rodriguez, Davenport. One by one, individuals rose, mostly men in suits, women in stilettos. They walked toward the back hallway, where frosted glass doors led to conference rooms. Elnora's name wasn't called. She wasn't surprised. She stepped toward the receptionist again, this time more firmly. He looked up, sighed, and reached into a side drawer. Instead of assistance, he pulled out a laminated floor map and shoved it toward her. "Self-check-ins over there," he muttered. The map was outdated. Red zones marked restricted staff-only hallways, while blue arrows twisted in circles with no labeled destinations. She took it anyway. She followed the arrows. They led to a hallway adjacent to the executive lounge. As she passed, two women standing inside looked up from their coffees. One of them raised an eyebrow and turned her body slightly, shielding her handbag. Another staffer emerged, nearly bumping into her, then stopped short. His eyes dropped to her shoes, then quickly back up. "Oh, sorry," he said flatly, and squeezed past her, leaving her with a lingering scent of cologne and dismissal. She reached the security door marked "Authorized Access Only." Her appointment was behind that door. She buzzed once. No response. She buzzed again. A red light blinked above the keypad. Then silence. Behind her, the elevator dinged open. A man in a bright blue tie stepped out, glanced at her, then immediately veered away, pretending to check his phone. The red light blinked again, and then shut off entirely. Elnora stepped back. The door remained locked. A security camera mounted above tilted downward, focusing squarely on her face. For 5 seconds, the lens did not blink. Then it slowly turned away. She walked back to the lobby. The janitor's cart was gone, but the wet floor sign remained, positioned neatly beside the chair she tried to sit in earlier. She returned to her standing position by the divider. Then came the pivot, no eye contact, no acknowledgement. He called forward the next person, a man in a branded vest and gold watch, who barely glanced in her direction before stepping ahead. Elnora's jaw tightened subtly, almost imperceptibly. She reached for her clipboard again, adjusted her grip, and kept her posture straight. Her presence wasn't loud, but it was firm. She waited for him to turn back to her. He didn't. Instead, a second receptionist, a woman in a light gray suit with a nameplate that read "Came in Row," stepped up beside the desk, handed Elnora a new form, and said, "Could you fill this out while you wait, ma'am?" The tone was polite, professional, neutral enough to sound routine. Elnora took the form. It wasn't familiar. Supplementary demographic details. It read at the top in clean serif typeface. There was no explanation of purpose, just a series of odd questions. Preferred spoken language, birthplace, ethnic identity options that spanned 2 pages, current citizenship status, family household size, and an optional field for estimated monthly support from charitable programs. At the bottom, one checkbox had already been selected in black ink. Interpreter required English as a second language. Elnora stared at the form, her mouth tightening slightly. Her accent was neutral Midwestern. She had been born in Indiana, grew up near Fort Wayne, and graduated top of her class from a private high school before earning her accounting degree with honors. She had never needed an interpreter in her life, but the box was checked, as if her name or face had filled it by default. She looked up at the receptionist again. He wasn't paying attention. His conversation with a new client involved laughter and an extended handshake. Elnora sat down again, unfolding her document case carefully on her lap. She slid the unnecessary form into the back pocket and pulled out her original appointment confirmation, gently tapping its top edge against her palm. She had planned for this meeting for weeks. She had cross-checked the files herself, organized each section by compliance quarter, and flagged discrepancies in color-coded tabs. These weren't basic records. They were part of a national audit linked to a loan portfolio that had not been publicly reviewed in 6 years. Yet here she sat, asked whether she needed an interpreter to read her own country's forms. After another long pause, she approached the front desk again. This time she spoke, soft, direct, and calm. "I have an appointment. I'd like to confirm I'm on the list." K. Monroe smiled without warmth and turned the screen toward herself. She scrolled. Her fingers paused, then resumed. There must be a system delay. We're cycling in some upgrades today. Can you fill out the blue form in the meantime?" Elnora opened her mouth slightly, but didn't reply. The explanation was vague, meaningless. A system delay? From a confirmed email, with a printed timestamp and calendar attachment? She didn't press. She simply turned away and returned to her corner seat. As she sat, a man in a charcoal gray suit walked by briskly, glanced at her clipboard, then doubled back and leaned down slightly. "Are you in the right building?" he asked, not aggressively, but with the bluntness of someone who had no expectation she belonged. Elnora raised her eyes to meet his. "Yes," she said. Nothing more. He blinked, nodded once, and moved on. Behind him, two women in pencil skirts and identical blazers exited the elevator carrying silver tablets. They didn't look at her, but one slowed long enough to drop a pamphlet on the table near her chair. "First-time investor? Let's talk budgeting basics," the cover read, with a smiling cartoon couple standing beside a piggy bank. Elnora didn't touch it. The security guard had now moved to stand slightly closer to her end of the room. He wasn't watching anyone else, just her. His stance was relaxed, but his eyes were fixed. 10 more minutes passed. When the next wave of names was called for meetings, hers was not among them. She didn't stand, didn't ask, but her jaw had tensed and her fingers had begun to curl slightly against the edge of the document case. The fake smile of neutrality was starting to crack around her. The next affront came subtly. A young intern pushing a cart of bottled waters and breath mints came by, offering refreshments to every seated guest in the main lobby, except her. He rolled past with a practiced grin, skipped a row, and offered drinks to the couple on the far end. The woman there glanced toward Elnora as if noticing the snub. She said nothing. No one ever did. Not here. Not to her. A few minutes later, the LED screen behind reception flickered again. A new internal message appeared. Reminder: clients lacking ID or unverified appointments must remain in designated seating zones. A small red dot blinked beside the message. Elnora looked up, then around. Her seat had no markings, no rope. But as she turned to glance behind her, she saw a placard that had quietly been placed at the far side of her row. Walk-in consultations, Tier 3 financial advising only. She had never been told about tiers. No such system was listed on the website. She was scheduled to meet with a portfolio strategy officer, not a Tier 3 advisor. The office was deliberately pushing her downward, softly, smoothly, beneath the radar. At this point, Elnora stopped trying to interpret it as coincidence. It wasn't. It never was. Still, she didn't leave. She didn't protest. She adjusted the fold of her skirt and opened her folder again, reviewing her notes by hand. The seat, slightly firmer than the others and away from the main hallway traffic, gave her at least a few feet of personal space. She placed her document case neatly on her lap and resumed reading, eyes flicking over figures, recalculating inconsistencies she already knew by heart. That moment of stillness lasted less than 60 seconds. The janitor returned. Same gloves, same yellow cart, but now with a laminated sign in hand. He didn't speak. He simply stepped forward, bent slightly, and slipped the sign into the gap between the cushion and the armrest of her seat. The bold black text on a red background read, "Under sanitation, possible dermatitis risk. Avoid prolonged contact." It wasn't taped or secured, just placed, deliberate, visible. Elnora looked at it, then at the janitor. He didn't meet her eyes. Instead, he set down the mop and gently angled its handle across the space in front of her, forming a silent barrier. It wasn't touching her, but it might as well have been a neon sign blinking, "Don't belong." She didn't move immediately. Instead, she slowly gathered her case again, stood, and stepped 3 paces back. The moment she cleared the space, he slipped into it with a bucket and began mopping furiously. though the floor was spotless. The sound of wet fibers swiping across tile echoed louder than necessary, and a faint chemical smell filled the air. A woman seated nearby wrinkled her nose and pulled her handbag closer. The janitor didn't glance up. Elnora moved again. She crossed to the client lounge, a space designed to impress, warm lighting, frosted glass dividers, imported art on the walls. A hospitality attendant stood at a mobile drink station. As she approached, he glanced up, then down again at the cups in his hands. Without a word, he placed a small plastic cup onto the tray and poured a modest stream of coffee into it from a side carafe. Around them, other guests sipped from porcelain mugs etched with the First Dominion crest. Elnora took the plastic cup and thanked him softly. He didn't respond. She found a standing counter near the window, lifted the cup to her lips, and paused. It was lukewarm, faintly bitter, the taste of being tolerated. On the far side of the lounge, a woman in a crimson suit laughed at something a banker whispered into her ear. She lifted her mug, took a sip, and clinked it lightly on the marble table as if sealing a deal. The difference was visual, auditory, social. Elnora's presence had been categorized by default, non-client, unverified, perhaps even suspect. But not one of them. Another banker passed behind her, pushing a tray of pastries meant for executive-level guests. She turned slightly to make room. He kept walking, but as he neared her elbow, he cleared his throat, loudly, though there was no need. It was just enough to make her feel as if she were obstructing something she hadn't earned the right to stand beside. Back in the waiting area, two receptionists exchanged something between themselves, a whisper, a glance, and then laughter that quickly dissolved into straight faces when they caught her looking. The woman in gray, Kay Monroe, then leaned over the desk and quietly removed a sheet from the printer tray. Elnora could see her name printed at the top. She stood from her perch and began to approach the desk. But just as she reached halfway, Monroe handed the paper to a male associate who folded it, tucked it into a folder marked Review Queue, and walked away down a hallway marked Internal Access Only. No one explained. No one looked her way again. As she returned to her corner, another man, bald, tie askew, clearly in a rush, strode into the lobby. He stepped in front of Elnora in line at the refreshment station and grabbed the last clean porcelain mug. The attendant looked at Elnora, reached under the table, and pulled out another plastic cup from a different sleeve. This one was chipped at the rim. Elnora accepted it without flinching. She poured herself a half cup of black coffee and resumed waiting. The hallway clock above the reception desk ticked past her scheduled appointment by another 20 minutes. Still no call. Still no name spoken aloud. More guests entered. She watched as each was greeted, validated, seated, served. One particularly tall woman with a sleek bob and tailored slacks seemed lost for a moment. Elnora stepped aside to allow her space. The woman gave her a half smile, then turned to a staff member who immediately rushed over to escort her upstairs. No questions, no forms, just movement. Elnora's feet ached from standing. She chose to sit again, but the sanitation sign was still draped over the chair she had taken earlier. Another had been placed on the next seat. She searched for an available spot, but found none without labels, spills, or paper stacks. She leaned against the edge of a side table instead. A few people noticed. None offered their seats. Behind the reception counter, someone whispered, and the security guard repositioned again, his arms now crossed over his chest. He stared, not aggressive, not friendly, just present, like a warning. Elnora set her plastic cup down and wiped her palms slowly across her skirt. Her fingers brushed the edge of the folder in her case. Inside were not only financial statements, but records of internal authorization breaches, hidden code markers in lending documents, signed off without federal oversight. She knew the weight of what she carried. And still, it didn't exempt her from being treated like furniture. The doors slid open with a quiet hiss, revealing the brushed steel interior and the polished marble floor beneath her feet. As she stepped inside, the doors began to close. Suddenly, a large hand shot out from the side and slammed against the panel, holding the doors open. A man, uniformed in security black, stepped inside with a purposeful stride. His gaze locked on her, but his expression was unreadable. Without a word, he positioned himself so close that her shoulder brushed his arm. The elevator felt smaller, the space between them tight and oppressive. The security officer's presence was a silent assertion of power. The doors remained open for an agonizing 30 seconds longer than usual. Then the man pressed the emergency stop. The gentle hum of the elevator stopped abruptly, replaced by a mechanical click and a low alarm tone somewhere in the walls. Elnora's eyes flicked to the panel, where a red light blinked erratically. She did not panic. She had been through worse. The security officer relaxed slightly, crossing his arms and looking straight ahead as if nothing had happened. The elevator stood still, its dim lights casting long shadows. After what felt like an eternity, the doors reopened. The officer stepped out first, nodding to the hallway guard who silently acknowledged him. Elnora followed, her steps measured and unhurried despite the sudden disruption. Once outside, she found herself in a small vestibule lined with frosted glass walls and metal railings. The corridor here was quieter, colder. Ahead were two doors marked "Authorized Personnel Only," with a keypad entry system flashing a green light beside them. Elnora paused. She reached into her blouse pocket and pulled out a small, folded card, a visitor badge issued the previous day. She scanned it across the keypad. The system rejected it with a soft buzz. She tried again. No response. Behind her, footsteps echoed, and she turned to see the same security officer approaching. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said without raising his voice, "but your credentials don't permit access to this level." Elnora's expression remained calm, but her lips tightened. She lowered the badge and nodded, stepping back. Before she could consider an alternate route, the officer gestured behind her. A narrow service staircase led down. "You can use the stairs to reach the third-floor conference room." Elnora glanced at the dimly lit stairwell, noting the worn handrails and flickering fluorescent bulbs. The stairwell smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals and stale air. She didn't hesitate. Her footsteps echoed softly on the concrete steps as she descended. At the landing, she paused to adjust her skirt, her document case firmly held in one hand. At the bottom, she emerged into the basement level, a labyrinth of corridors lined with supply closets and maintenance rooms. The harsh overhead lighting contrasted sharply with the warmth of the upper floors. She moved forward, keeping her pace steady despite the unfamiliar surroundings. As she turned a corner, the building's internal intercom crackled to life overhead, broadcasting indistinct murmurs of conversation. The echoes bounced off metal pipes and cinder block walls. It was a space no client was meant to see, much less pass through. Her phone remained silent in her purse. She made no calls. The absence of communication was a testament to the deliberate isolation she faced. Reaching a stairwell on the other side, she climbed upward, this time to the fourth floor. The atmosphere shifted. The lighting softened, the walls were painted a muted cream, and framed certificates hung in neat rows. But the door at the end of the hall, marked Executive Conference, remained firmly shut. She pressed her hand against the polished wood, searching for the door handle. It didn't budge. From within, muffled voices rose, indistinct but unmistakably human. She stepped back and scanned the area. A small keypad blinked red beside the doorframe. No badge, no code, no welcome. She was shut out once again. Nearby, a janitor pushing a cart paused, locking eyes with her briefly before turning away. She exhaled slowly, steadying herself. Her journey from the glittering lobby to these shadowed corridors had been a descent not just in physical space, but in recognition and respect. Every barrier, every detour was a message. She was not welcome. But Elnora was no stranger to resistance. She retrieved her documents, adjusted her posture, and returned toward the elevator shaft, resolved to find another way. At the elevator bank, she found a single operator stationed. He glanced up at her with a forced smile, pressed the button to the executive floor, and held the doors open. As she entered, she caught a glimpse of another staff member whispering into a headset, eyes narrowed. The elevator ascended silently, lights counting up floor by floor until they settled on executive level. The doors opened into a corridor lined with plush carpeting and soft ambient lighting. She stepped out, feeling the weight of unseen eyes tracking her progress. The hallway stretched long and silent. At the far end, double doors stood ajar. A muted conversation slipped through. The corridor was lined with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline, sunlight streaming in to create patterns on the plush carpet. It was an impressive space, designed for comfort and privilege. Yet, as she stepped inside, a large LED screen dominating one wall immediately drew her attention. It displayed a rolling slideshow of internal metrics and client segmentation data. Among the colorful graphs and charts, one particular slide caught her eye, a heat map titled Client Tier Risk Analysis, with color-coded regions representing financial reliability across demographics. At the bottom of the map was a highlighted category labeled African American women, ages 40-55, marked in a deep crimson shade. Adjacent to the category was a small icon of a question mark enclosed in a red circle. Beneath it, faint text read, "Requires re-verification and limited portfolio access." Elnora's heart sank slightly. This was not just a chart, it was a judgment, a classification that reduced entire groups to risk factors. The room's other occupants paid no mind to the display, but she could feel the weight of the message pressing down on her. To her left, a woman in a tailored navy suit stood up and approached a service counter. The attendant handed her a glossy pamphlet titled Financial Literacy Workshops, Rebuilding Credit for Long-Term Success. The woman smiled and walked away, glancing briefly at Elnora's corner as if to compare notes. Moments later, a junior associate passed by Elnora's seat and deliberately dropped a similar pamphlet on the floor next to her feet. The cover featured smiling cartoon figures and large text, "Budgeting Basics for Clients with History of Financial Challenges." Elnora did not react immediately. She picked up the pamphlet, flipped through the pages, and carefully placed it inside her document case. The subtle stigmatization was unmistakable. It was a quiet branding of her as someone who belonged in a lower tier, regardless of her expertise or credentials. She looked around the room. The plush chairs were arranged in clusters, occupied by groups of smiling executives and wealthy clients engaged in light conversation. The soft clinking of fine china and the faint aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. Elnora reached for a glass on a nearby table only to be offered a small, plain plastic cup by a passing server. No explanation, no apology, just the stark difference in treatment. Across the room, two men in tailored suits spoke in low voices, glancing repeatedly toward her. Their eyes carried skepticism, disbelief, and a silent message. "You are not one of us." She felt the chill of exclusion, even as she maintained a composed exterior. As the briefing began, the presenter distributed detailed folders containing portfolio summaries and investment projections. Elnora noted the folders were all printed on thick, glossy paper with embossed logos, except hers. Her folder was matte, slightly thinner, the printing faded in some places. She touched the cover lightly, sensing how every detail, however small, communicated status. Throughout the session, Elnora was acutely aware of the subtle distance. When questions were posed, speakers directed their responses to others seated near her, but never to her. Her attempts to interject were met with polite nods or quick redirections. One man, seated diagonally across from her, tapped his pen on the table in a staccato rhythm each time she opened her mouth. The pace grew faster, an unspoken sign of impatience. At one point, a server brought refreshments. The trays were lined with silver platters holding delicate finger sandwiches, artisan cheeses, and imported chocolates. The waitstaff passed out sparkling water in crystal flutes to every guest, except Elnora. Instead, a plain bottle of tap water was set before her, the label peeling at the edges. She accepted it without comment, but noted the isolation it symbolized. As the session neared its end, the presenter handed out feedback forms. Elnora received a blank sheet with no header or logo. Others received branded cards with colorful graphics and executive signatures. The contrast was unmistakable. Leaving the briefing, she walked past a mirrored wall and caught a glimpse of herself. Her expression was calm, but her eyes betrayed a storm of frustration. She smoothed a crease in her skirt and adjusted the strap of her document case. She was a ghost in a place built to celebrate the elite. The lobby beyond the briefing room bustled with energy. Staff and clients mingled effortlessly. Elnora stood near the exit, watching the flow of people. A young woman with bright eyes approached the reception desk and was greeted with a warm smile and an immediate offer of assistance. Nearby, a group of executives laughed softly, exchanging business cards and polite pleasantries. Elnora's phone buzzed in her purse. She ignored it. She approached the receptionist's desk once more, this time with the quiet confidence of someone who knew the rules and had every right to be there. She asked simply to confirm the location for her next appointment, a one-on-one session with a senior compliance officer. The receptionist, a woman with sharp features and cold eyes, typed slowly, her fingers pausing over the keyboard as if weighing the decision. Then, in a soft but firm voice, she said, "I'm sorry, ma'am. Your appointment for this afternoon has been canceled due to a scheduling conflict." Elnora's expression didn't change. "Can you please confirm who canceled it and why?" she asked evenly. The receptionist glanced sideways, then leaned toward a colleague, whispering. The conversation was inaudible, but their eyes flicked toward Elnora like a pair of shuttered windows. After a long pause, the receptionist replied, "There was an internal reorganization. Your session is no longer on the calendar." Elnora's heart sank briefly, but she remained composed. She requested to see the supervisor in charge of scheduling. The receptionist frowned, but made a call. Minutes later, a mid-level manager arrived. His demeanor was detached but courteous. He repeated the cancellation and added, "We're reallocating resources to prioritize clients with immediate lending needs." Elnora pressed for clarification, mentioning her role as a federal auditor and the urgency of her investigation. The manager nodded slowly but maintained his distance, replying, "I understand, but unfortunately, your session cannot be reinstated at this time." Frustrated but undeterred, Elnora requested access to the internal scheduling system. The manager looked uneasy but led her to a workstation. Sitting down, she opened the calendar app, scrolling through weeks of appointments. Her own name was absent. The screen displayed a warning message. User access limited. Administrator permissions required. She reached for the keyboard but was stopped by a security guard who appeared without announcement. "That's enough, ma'am," he said quietly. She closed the laptop and stood, her resolve hardening. Outside the reception area, she was directed to a small conference room to await further instructions. The room was stark, with gray walls and a single window barred by thick blinds. She took a seat at the small table and pulled out her documents. Minutes stretched into an hour. A door opened, and a staff member entered carrying a thick file labeled Client Verification Pending Review. He placed it on the table without meeting her eyes. Opening the folder revealed a stack of forms stamped incomplete and requires further validation. Elnora flipped through pages filled with data entries and coded remarks. Remarks she knew were fabrications designed to delay her progress. A note in bold read, "Verify identity and intent before granting system access." It was clear her credentials were under unnecessary scrutiny. Moments later, the phone on the table rang. She answered it. The voice on the other end was clipped and professional. "Ms. Briggs, this is the Director of Client Services. Your presence is requested in the executive lobby." The line went dead. Elnora gathered her things and headed back through the corridors. Approaching the executive lobby, she noticed a group of staff waiting nearby. As she passed, they exchanged quiet glances and smirks. One whispered something to another. When she reached the lobby, a cluster of security personnel stood near the entrance. They blocked her path without explanation. Before she could speak, a senior executive emerged from a nearby office. His gaze was cold but controlled. "Ms. Briggs, I regret to inform you that due to internal policy revisions, your current level of clearance does not permit you to proceed further in this building at this time." She held his gaze steadily. "I am here on official federal business. My clearance is valid." He shook his head slowly. "The policies have been updated. You will need to resubmit your credentials through proper channels." Without waiting for a response, he motioned to the security team, who escorted her toward the exit. On the way out, a staff member handed her a thick envelope marked "Further documentation required." Inside were forms requesting additional personal information and multiple signatures. She stepped forward with a small stack of requested documents clutched in her hand, prepared to present them and move forward with her work. However, as she approached the front desk, a middle-aged man in a crisp navy suit intercepted her path. Without introduction or explanation, he held up a gloved hand and said nothing, effectively blocking her way. Elnora's gaze met his. His face was expressionless, but his eyes carried an unmistakable message. "You are not welcome here." Before she could respond, a young woman with a camera phone stepped forward, filming. Her presence was inconspicuous but purposeful. Elnora recognized the unspoken play. This was not a mere obstruction, it was a spectacle. Without a word, the suited man took the documents from her hand. He flipped through them quickly, then looked up and handed them to another staff member nearby, who placed them on a metal cart lined with files and folders. The cart was pushed deliberately toward a back room labeled "Confidential Review." As the cart disappeared through the double doors, the man turned to Elnora with a faint, mocking smile. Without moving his lips, he gestured toward a long row of chairs along the lobby wall. Understanding the command, Elnora nodded silently and walked toward the seating area. When she sat, she noticed that the chair was positioned next to a large trash bin overflowing with discarded coffee cups and used tissues. The seat was worn and stained, clearly less cared for than the others. Throughout the lobby, other clients were approached and led directly to private offices or meeting rooms, their names called out by polite staff members who guided them with warmth and respect. Elnora, however, was left alone, a subject of quiet observation. Staff lingered nearby, whispering in low tones and exchanging furtive glances. The young woman with the camera phone circled slowly, capturing Elnora's isolation from every angle. Elnora's face remained composed, but her fingers trembled slightly as she held her hands in her lap. Minutes passed. A janitor wheeled a cart past, pausing beside her seat long enough to rearrange the trash bin so it blocked part of her view toward the main reception area. She caught the janitor's eye. He looked away quickly. Nearby, a group of employees gathered around a conference table, laughing softly while glancing in her direction. She caught fragments of conversation. "That's the one from yesterday. Can you believe she's still here? Does she even know what she's up against?" The comments were whispered but sharp as knives. Elnora held their gazes with quiet defiance, but felt the sting of public scrutiny. She knew this was a calculated effort to break her resolve through shame and isolation. Later, a staff member approached with a large envelope, slid it across the table in front of her without a word, and left. Elnora opened it to find a series of memos and letters, each questioning her identity, her credentials, her authority to conduct the audit. One document questioned whether she had proper clearance and implied she might be an imposter or fraud. The official seals on the letters were either smudged or faded, adding an element of forgery or deception. Her stomach tightened. This was no longer passive resistance. It was a direct attack on her character. She folded the letters carefully and placed them in her case. As the afternoon wore on, she was called to a small side room for further discussion. The room was bare except for a table and 2 chairs. Opposite her sat 2 bank attorneys, their faces neutral but unreadable. They presented a stack of paperwork and demanded she sign a non-disclosure agreement, forbidding her from discussing any part of her investigation with outside parties. Elnora refused, explaining the federal nature of her audit and her obligation to report findings transparently. The attorneys exchanged a look. One stood and said, "We will escalate this matter if you do not comply." She was left alone, the door closing behind her with a soft click. Her isolation deepened, the walls seeming to close in with every passing hour. Despite this, Elnora's resolve only grew stronger. She knew the tactics well: intimidation through public shaming, bureaucratic stonewalling, and character assassination. But she was prepared. She gathered her documents and returned to the lobby, pausing for a moment before the exit. Yet this day was different for her. She carried with her not just documents, but something far more potent, a symbol of unquestionable authority. Her footsteps echoed faintly as she navigated through the familiar corridors toward the executive offices. She passed the reception where a clerk glanced up briefly but said nothing. Approaching the imposing oak door marked executive archive, she reached into the inner pocket of her blouse and withdrew a small, unassuming leather pouch. From within, she removed a heavy brass seal embossed with an intricate six-pointed star surrounded by concentric circles of text, an official insignia belonging to the Federal Financial Oversight Committee. She pressed the seal gently against a recessed indentation on the office door's frame. A faint click sounded as the locking mechanism disengaged. The door swung open silently, revealing rows of filing cabinets, each meticulously labeled and locked. Elnora stepped inside and closed the door behind her. She set her case down on a nearby desk and moved toward a cabinet marked Audit Protocols Confidential. With deliberate care, she produced a worn folder stamped with the same brass seal. The folder contained official federal audit directives related to the multi-billion-dollar loan portfolio of the bank. Opening it revealed sealed documents and appointment letters bearing signatures and watermarks that no employee at the bank could challenge. Her presence in this room was a turning point, no longer a marginalized outsider, but an enforcer of accountability. She methodically laid out the documents across the desk and reviewed notes, cross-referencing them with digital records stored on a secure drive she kept on a separate encrypted device. Outside the room, unnoticed by the staff, the building's internal security system detected an authorization change. A series of low-tone chimes echoed softly, unnoticed except by the building's control center. Within minutes, a hidden panel behind a portrait of the bank's founder slid open, revealing a bank of monitors. Screens flickered to life, displaying audit mode activated and a list of user access revocations. Staff members working in the adjacent offices suddenly found their computers locked. A message flashed: Federal audit in progress, unauthorized access denied. Meanwhile, in the conference room just down the hall, a meeting in progress abruptly paused. Executives glanced at their phones and devices as notifications flooded in about the audit activation. In the hallway, whispers turned to urgent conversations. Elnora stepped out of the archive room and walked calmly toward the executive conference area. Staff who moments ago had ignored her now parted to let her pass. No words were exchanged, but the shift in atmosphere was palpable. She reached the conference room and placed her sealed folder firmly on the polished table, commanding attention without speaking. The senior executives seated around her leaned forward, their expressions a mixture of shock, apprehension, and grudging respect. On the main screen behind her, the bank's financial data and irregularities began to scroll, revealing hidden transactions, unapproved loans, and suspicious account activity. The room fell into silence, the magnitude of the revelations sinking in. Elnora's eyes scanned the faces before her, her calm demeanor unwavering. This silent revelation spoke louder than any speech could. No arguments, no protests, just irrefutable evidence laid bare in front of the decision-makers who had long ignored it. The power dynamics shifted. Those who had sought to exclude and discredit her were now forced to reckon with the truth she carried. Yet, despite the triumph, Elnora knew the battle was far from over. Outside the building, her arrival and presence had already sparked quiet murmurs among the staff and security personnel. Without a word, the bank's internal systems began to shift, acknowledging a command far above its usual protocols. The massive LED screens scattered throughout the building flickered abruptly, shifting from promotional content and innocuous financial data to urgent, unmistakable messages emblazoned in bold blue and white text. Unannounced federal audit in progress, followed by a line reading, Authority ID, Brig Z Alpha, which cycled continuously across the display. Staff members in adjacent offices suddenly found their terminals locked down. Screens flashed access denied, and login sessions terminated mid-task. The humming of machines crescendoed briefly, punctuated by alert tones and soft chimes signifying system lockdown. Several employees instinctively looked toward their computers in confusion, murmuring to one another in hushed tones. The receptionist who had previously ignored Elnora now stood rigid, watching the screens with growing unease. Behind closed doors, executive teams were forced to halt their meetings as their conference room displays synchronized with the building-wide alert. The bank's sprawling internal communication network buzzed as automated voice announcements repeated the audit's activation in secure conference halls and staff break rooms. In the main data center, a flurry of activity erupted as network administrators scrambled to understand the sudden lockdown. Firewalls intensified, and encrypted audit trails began recording every user's action with new scrutiny. On the floors above, security cameras automatically repositioned to focus on key access points, entrances, and restricted areas, their lenses tracking staff movements meticulously. Elnora remained seated calmly, watching the effect of her authority ripple outward. The executives around her exchanged nervous glances. The silence that followed was heavy, loaded with the unspoken recognition that the situation had escalated beyond any prior negotiation or delay tactics. Digital logs began populating with audit entries naming 6 high-ranking individuals directly connected to questionable financial transactions. Their names, titles, and amount were listed. The branch manager, 2 department heads, and 3 loan officers. Each name was accompanied by a timestamped summary of anomalies and unauthorized activity tied to the bank's $5.7 billion loan portfolio. None of the implicated individuals had been aware that their actions were now under direct federal scrutiny. As notifications pinged on their devices, panic flickered across their faces. Some hurriedly gathered personal belongings. Others sat frozen in disbelief. The security team, previously indifferent to Elnora's presence, now moved with urgency, positioning themselves strategically around sensitive offices and entrances. Wordlessly, the atmosphere shifted from casual corporate routine to controlled crisis management. Outside the executive suite, Elnora observed the controlled chaos with quiet satisfaction. The system she had set in motion was impartial and relentless. It cared not for politics or power plays, only for accuracy and enforcement. She knew that the bank's leadership was facing an unprecedented moment of accountability. Meanwhile, the public lobby began to fill with whispers as staff shared their observations about the unusual digital activity and lockdowns. Some questioned the cause, while others speculated about potential consequences. Among the security personnel, a brief, urgent conversation ensued via encrypted radios. Cameras captured discrete footage of staff exiting their workstations under supervision. Elnora understood that within hours, this audit would cascade into investigations beyond the bank itself, reaching regulators, lawmakers, and the media. Her role had shifted from observer to instigator of a transformative process that no amount of denial or obstruction could halt. Yet even as the building descended into high alert, she remained composed, methodically reviewing the documents spread before her. Her steady gaze met that of the chief compliance officer who had reluctantly taken a seat beside her, silently acknowledging the gravity of the moment. The audit was no longer a shadowy threat. The weeks following the systemic lockdown and the unmasking of hidden financial irregularities inside First Dominion Bank were marked by relentless upheaval. Elnora Briggs watched as the carefully built facade of power and privilege began to crumble with a quiet but inexorable force. The bank, once a fortress of exclusivity, was now the epicenter of a federal investigation that had exposed deep-rooted corruption and blatant discrimination. Early one morning, just as the sun cast long shadows across the city streets, Elnora arrived at the main branch once more. This time, her presence carried a new weight, a symbol not just of authority, but of justice served. The massive revolving doors opened to reveal a scene transformed. Outside the building, media vans and reporters gathered in unprecedented numbers, their cameras trained on the entrance. Flash bulbs popped like distant thunder, capturing images of the woman who had brought a titan to its knees. Inside, the lobby was quieter but heavier. Employees whispered nervously as they passed each other, aware that many colleagues were no longer present. Among them was the former branch manager, who had been formally arrested days earlier. Security personnel flanked him on each side, his hands cuffed and expression vacant, escorted through the very halls where he had once commanded respect. The arrest was broadcast live on news networks, with commentators dissecting the details of embezzlement, fraud, and systemic abuse of power uncovered under Elnora's audit. A week later, multiple senior executives were suspended and their access cards deactivated. Confidential documents were seized as investigators combed through digital and physical records. Shareholders and board members convened emergency meetings to address the fallout, their voices tinged with panic and denial. The bank's stock plummeted, losing a significant percentage of its value in a matter of days. Yet, amid the chaos, Elnora maintained her focus. Her audit had done more than expose wrongdoing. It had revealed a culture of exclusion and injustice that demanded reckoning. Her work extended beyond numbers and policies. It touched on the very soul of the institution. In a quiet conference room, she sat across from federal prosecutors, providing detailed testimony that paved the way for criminal charges against those who had enabled the abuses. Her calm demeanor and meticulous documentation left no room for doubt. Months later, as reforms were mandated and a federal oversight committee installed, Elnora was invited to participate in a national forum on financial equity and accountability. There, she shared insights on how systems of power can be dismantled from within by unwavering dedication to truth and justice. Back at First Dominion, the building's once imposing logo was removed. New signage heralded a commitment to transparency and inclusion. Former employees who had been complicit faced not only legal consequences but professional ostracization. The community around the bank, long skeptical of its practices, watched cautiously as new leadership promised sweeping changes. Elnora returned to the building one final time, this time as a guest at a ceremony inaugurating the newly formed Federal Anti-Discrimination and Financial Ethics Task Force. She walked through the halls, now brighter and filled with fresh faces, some of whom approached her with gratitude and renewed hope. At the ceremony's close, she addressed the gathered officials, industry leaders, and media. Her words resonated beyond the walls of the room. Justice is not a destination, but a continuous journey. True accountability requires us to confront uncomfortable truths, challenge entrenched systems, and recognize the dignity of every individual regardless of background or appearance. This work is far from over, but today marks a new chapter, one where equity is not just a policy, but a promise. Outside, as cameras captured her final moments on the building steps, Elnora paused. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow across the skyline. She felt the weight of the past months lift slightly, replaced by the resolve to continue fighting wherever injustice persisted. The battle had been hard-fought, but meaningful. It was proof that even in the face of overwhelming resistance, change was possible when courage met conviction. The end. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like and subscribe for more gripping tales of justice and resilience. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think of Elnora's journey and the way the plot unfolded? Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. Your feedback means a lot and helps shape future stories.